Every day, billions of people look at the same tool to organize their lives: a calendar. It tells us when to work, when to travel, when to celebrate, and when a new year begins. It feels so familiar that most of us never stop to question how it is built. But when you look closely, the structure begins to feel strangely irregular. January has 31 days. February has 28, sometimes 29. April has 30. July returns to 31 again. Weeks move through the months without ever lining up neatly. And every year, the entire calendar shifts. A date that falls on Monday one year may land on Tuesday the next. From a mathematical point of view, the system looks surprisingly uneven. Yet there is a much simpler way a year could be organized. Imagine a calendar with 13 months, each with exactly 28 days. Every month would contain 4 perfect weeks. Every date would always fall on the same weekday. A clean, symmetrical design. Which leads to an interesting question. If a simpler calendar exists, why doesn't humanity use it? The calendar is one of the most fundamental systems in human civilization. It quietly organizes the rhythm of everyday life. Farmers once relied on it to understand the seasons. Religions built rituals and holidays around it. Governments schedule laws, taxes, and elections by it. And for most people, it simply marks the flow of ordinary days. Today, almost the entire world follows the same system. It is known as the Gregorian calendar. At first glance, it appears simple and familiar. A year is divided into 12 months. Altogether, those months contain 365 days. Time moves forward in repeating cycles of 7-day weeks. Because this system surrounds us from childhood, it rarely feels unusual. It is printed on our phones, on office walls, and in school notebooks. We use it without thinking. The calendar feels like a natural map of time itself. But when you begin to examine it more closely, small irregularities begin to appear. The months are not equal in length. Some contain 31 days, others have 30. February is shorter than all the rest. At the same time, the cycle of weeks does not fit neatly inside the months. Weeks simply pass through them, cutting across the boundaries. There is another curious detail. The same calendar date never stays attached to the same weekday. One year a date may fall on Monday. The next year it shifts to Tuesday, then Wednesday. From a distance, the system feels stable, but up close the pattern looks uneven, which raises an interesting question. Why is the calendar designed this way? Long before the modern calendar appeared on office walls and phone screens, people were already trying to organize time in a reliable way. Early societies watched the sky carefully. The movement of the sun, the phases of the moon, and the changing seasons helped them decide when to plant crops, hold festivals, or mark the passing of a year. In ancient Rome, one of the most influential early calendar systems began to take shape. The Roman calendar was originally tied to the cycles of the moon. Months followed lunar patterns, and the year itself did not always align neatly with the natural solar cycle. Over time, this system became increasingly difficult to manage. Political leaders and priests sometimes adjusted the calendar for practical or political reasons, adding or removing days in ways that made the system unpredictable. By the 1st century before the Common Era, the Roman calendar had drifted far from the natural seasons. Winters were appearing earlier in the official calendar than they should have. Festivals and agricultural schedules no longer matched the actual rhythm of the year. This problem eventually led to one of the most important calendar reforms in history. In 45 BCE, Julius Caesar introduced a new system that would later become known as the Julian calendar. Instead of relying primarily on the moon, this new calendar was based on the solar year. Caesar worked with astronomers of the time to estimate the length of the year and reorganize the calendar accordingly. The Julian calendar divided the year into 12 months and established a year of 365 days. To account for the extra fraction of a day in the solar cycle, an additional day was added every 4 years. This became the first systematic use of what we now call a leap year. For centuries, the Julian calendar helped bring stability to the way people measured time. It spread across the Roman world and later across much of Europe. Governments, churches, and merchants all relied on this system to coordinate their activities. However, the system was not perfectly accurate. The solar year is slightly shorter than the value used in the Julian system. The difference is small, only a few minutes each year. But over long periods of time, those minutes slowly accumulate. By the 16th century, the calendar had drifted noticeably away from the actual position of the Earth in its orbit around the Sun. Important seasonal markers, including religious observances tied to the spring equinox, were beginning to move out of alignment with the natural year. This growing discrepancy led to another major reform. In 1582, Pope Gregory XIII introduced a revised calendar designed to correct the accumulated error. The new system adjusted the rules for leap years so that certain century years would no longer receive the extra day unless they met specific conditions. This small mathematical adjustment made the calendar much more accurate over long periods of time. The reform also required a direct correction. Several days were removed from the calendar to bring it back into alignment with the seasons. In some parts of Europe, the date simply jumped forward overnight. At first, not every country adopted the new system immediately. Catholic nations tended to adopt it earlier, while some Protestant and Orthodox regions waited decades, or even centuries, before making the change. Gradually, however, the revised system spread across the world. Governments, scientific institutions, and international trade increasingly required a shared way of measuring time. Today, the Gregorian calendar has become the global standard. It organizes international business, education, transportation, and everyday life for billions of people. And yet, even with these refinements, the underlying structure of the calendar remained largely unchanged. 12 months, uneven lengths, and a design that still carries traces of decisions made more than 2,000 years ago. When we look at the calendar today, it feels familiar and stable. It hangs on walls, appears on our phones, and quietly organizes the rhythm of everyday life. But if we step back and examine its structure more carefully, something begins to feel unusual. The modern calendar is built around the solar year. Astronomers have long known that the Earth takes a little more than 365 days to complete one full orbit around the Sun. More precisely, the solar year lasts about 365.2422 days. To keep our calendar aligned with that cycle, an additional day is occasionally added. This is the leap year adjustment introduced centuries ago. On the surface, the system seems carefully designed. But the deeper you look, the more irregular the structure appears. The year is divided into 12 months, yet those months are not equal. Some contain 31 days, others contain 30. February is shorter than the rest, with 28 days in most years and 29 in a leap year. This uneven pattern is something most people accept without question. It has become part of the background of daily life. But from a design perspective, it raises an interesting observation. Why are the months so different from one another? There is another detail that often goes unnoticed. The cycle of weeks does not align neatly with the months. Each week contains 7 days, but those weeks simply flow across the boundaries between months. A month rarely contains a perfect number of weeks. Because of this, the calendar never repeats itself in a simple pattern. The same date moves across the days of the week each year. A birthday that falls on a Monday this year might fall on a Tuesday next year, and on a Wednesday the year after that. In practical terms, we are used to this shifting pattern. But when viewed as a system of measurement, it appears surprisingly irregular. Some researchers and historians of calendar design have pointed out that this arrangement seems more historical than logical. The calendar we use today was shaped by centuries of decisions, adjustments, and compromises. Which raises an intriguing thought. What would a calendar look like if it were designed from scratch? One proposed answer is surprisingly simple. Imagine dividing the year into 13 months instead of 12. If each month contained 28 days, the structure would immediately become much more regular. 28 days form exactly 4 weeks. That means every month would contain 4 identical weeks. The calendar would repeat in a predictable pattern. 13 months of 28 days each would produce 364 days. Every month would be the same length. Every date would fall on the same weekday every year. In such a system, the calendar would look almost perfectly symmetrical. The flow of weeks and months would align cleanly. Planning schedules would become simpler, and the structure of the year would appear far more balanced. From a mathematical perspective, it is an elegant idea, which leads to a natural question. If such a symmetrical system is possible, why does the modern calendar still look so uneven? During the 19th and early 20th centuries, many parts of the world were undergoing a quiet but profound transformation. Governments, scientists, and engineers were beginning to rethink the systems that organized daily life. The goal was not simply convenience, it was precision. As industry expanded, societies became increasingly interconnected. Railways connected cities that had once been days apart. Telegraph lines carried messages across continents in minutes. Trade moved faster than ever before, and with that acceleration came a new problem. Time itself had to be standardized. For much of history, local time was determined by the position of the sun. Noon arrived when the sun reached its highest point in the sky. But this meant that every town had its own slightly different time. When trains began moving between cities, this system quickly became chaotic. In response, nations began introducing standardized time zones. By the late 19th century, large parts of the world had agreed to divide the planet into coordinated time regions. Clocks were synchronized. Schedules became predictable. At the same time, other systems of measurement were also being reformed. The metric system began spreading across Europe and eventually beyond it. Instead of dozens of local measurement traditions, a single universal system was introduced for length, weight, and volume. This broader movement reflected a powerful idea of the era. Human systems could be redesigned to become more logical, more efficient, and easier to use. Against this backdrop, some thinkers began looking at another ancient system that shaped daily life: the calendar. When examined closely, the traditional calendar appeared surprisingly uneven. Months had different lengths. Weeks did not align with months. The same dates shifted across weekdays each year. For centuries, these irregularities had simply been accepted as part of tradition. But during this period of reform, some scholars began to ask whether the calendar itself could also be improved. Several proposals started to appear in scientific journals and policy discussions. Some suggested dividing the year into equal quarters so that each season would follow an identical pattern. Others proposed fixed weekly cycles that would repeat perfectly each month. One idea in particular attracted attention. Instead of 12 uneven months, the year could be divided into 13 equal ones. Each month would contain 28 days. The weeks would align perfectly with the months, and the structure of the calendar would repeat in a clean and predictable way. Some historians suggest that these ideas were discussed not only by mathematicians and astronomers, but also by economists and industrial planners. In a world that was becoming increasingly organized around schedules and production cycles, a more regular calendar seemed appealing. The historical record shows that by the early 20th century, calendar reform had become a subject of real international debate. Which raises an interesting question. If the idea of redesigning the calendar was already being seriously considered, why did the system never change? During the 19th and early 20th centuries, many parts of the world entered a period of rapid transformation. Governments, scientists, and engineers began reconsidering the systems that organized daily life. The goal was not simply change. It was precision, order, and predictability. Industrialization was spreading across Europe and North America. Railways connected distant cities. Factories operated on strict schedules. International trade expanded quickly. In this new environment, even small differences in measurement could create confusion. As a result, societies began standardizing the basic systems used to measure the world. One important example was the rise of the metric system. Instead of many regional units for length and weight, countries gradually adopted a unified system based on simple mathematical relationships. The meter, kilogram, and liter replaced a patchwork of older measurements. At the same time, the measurement of time was also changing. For most of history, local time depended on the position of the sun. Each city followed its own clock. But when railways and telegraphs connected cities, this system became impractical. To solve this, standardized time zones were introduced. By the late 19th century, large parts of the world had agreed to divide the planet into coordinated regions of time. Clocks were synchronized. Schedules became predictable. This movement reflected a powerful belief of the era. Human systems could be redesigned to become more logical and efficient. In that environment, some thinkers began looking again at the calendar. The calendar had existed in roughly its modern form for centuries. Yet when examined closely, it contained several irregular features. Months had unequal lengths. Weeks did not align neatly with months. Dates shifted across weekdays every year. For generations, these details had simply been accepted as tradition. But during this period of reform, some scholars began asking whether the calendar itself could also be improved. Several proposals appeared in scientific discussions and policy debates. Some suggested dividing the year into equal quarters, so each season would follow the same pattern. Others proposed calendars built around fixed weekly cycles. One idea stood out for its simplicity. Instead of 12 uneven months, the year could be divided into 13 equal ones. Each month would contain exactly 28 days. The weeks would align perfectly with the months, creating a regular and predictable structure. Some historians suggest that these ideas attracted attention not only among scientists, but also among economists and industrial planners. In a world increasingly organized around schedules and production cycles, a more symmetrical calendar seemed appealing. The historical record shows that by the early 20th century, calendar reform had become a real international discussion, which raises an interesting question. If the world was redesigning so many systems of measurement, why did the calendar remain almost unchanged? By the early 20th century, the idea of redesigning the calendar was no longer an isolated thought experiment. It had begun appearing in different countries, proposed by different groups, often independently of one another. Some historians suggest that this pattern was not accidental. The world was becoming increasingly interconnected. International trade was expanding, global communication was accelerating, and many governments were searching for systems that could simplify coordination across borders. In that environment, the calendar itself began to look like a candidate for reform. Several new designs started to appear. Some proposals aimed to simplify the existing structure of the year while keeping 12 months. Others suggested more radical changes that would reorganize the calendar entirely. One of the most well-known proposals was called the International Fixed Calendar. This system divided the year into 13 months, each containing exactly 28 days. Every month had 4 identical weeks. Each date would always fall on the same weekday every year. In this design, the calendar would repeat in a perfectly regular pattern. A separate day at the end of the year would keep the system aligned with the solar cycle, but the structure of months and weeks would remain completely symmetrical. The idea attracted attention in business circles, particularly among companies that relied on precise scheduling. A predictable calendar could simplify accounting, production planning, and international coordination. At roughly the same time, another proposal emerged known as the World Calendar. This system kept the traditional 12 months, but reorganized them into 4 equal quarters. Each quarter would follow the same pattern of weeks and days, creating a repeating structure that would simplify long-term planning. Although these proposals differed in design, they shared a common goal. They attempted to remove irregularities from the calendar and replace them with a more balanced system. The historical record shows that these ideas were not limited to academic debates. Calendar reform began to appear in international discussions about global coordination. Some proposals were even reviewed by international organizations. During the early 20th century, the question of calendar reform was considered by committees connected to the League of Nations. For a brief period, it seemed possible that the calendar itself might become part of a larger effort to standardize global systems. Some historians suggest that, at that moment in history, a redesigned calendar did not seem unrealistic. Many other global systems were already being coordinated across borders, which raises an interesting question. If multiple proposals existed, and if the idea was discussed at an international level, why did none of these calendar reforms ever take effect? For many years, ideas about a more symmetrical calendar remained mostly theoretical. They appeared in academic papers, international conferences, and policy discussions. Scholars debated them, economists analyzed them, governments occasionally reviewed them, but one question remained. Could such a calendar actually work in the real world? In at least one case, the answer was tested. During the early 20th century, a large American company decided to experiment with a different calendar system inside its own organization. The company was Eastman Kodak. Kodak was not a small business. It was one of the most influential industrial corporations of its time, operating factories, offices, and distribution networks around the world. Managing time, schedules, and financial reporting was a major logistical challenge. In 1928, Kodak introduced the International Fixed Calendar for internal use. This calendar followed the symmetrical structure that reformers had proposed. The year was divided into 13 months. Each month contained exactly 28 days. Every month had 4 identical weeks. The pattern repeated throughout the entire year. From a planning perspective, the system was extremely regular. Each month had the same length. Each quarter contained the same number of weeks. Financial reports could be compared easily, because every accounting period contained the same number of days. For a large organization managing production cycles and corporate accounting, this kind of consistency was useful. The historical record shows that Kodak continued using this calendar internally for several decades. Employees scheduled meetings, tracked projects, and organized accounting periods according to the 13-month structure. Some historians note that many employees reportedly found the system easy to understand and convenient to use. In other words, the idea was not purely theoretical. In at least one major corporation, it functioned as a working calendar for everyday operations. So, if the system could work inside a large organization, why did it never spread further? Several explanations have been suggested. One of the most frequently mentioned involves religion. In many cultures, the 7-day week is not just a practical cycle. It carries deep religious meaning. Traditions connected to the Sabbath, Sunday worship, and other sacred days depend on an uninterrupted sequence of weeks. Some calendar reform proposals introduced special days outside the normal weekly cycle. While mathematically convenient, this would have interrupted the traditional pattern of religious observance. For many religious communities, that change was unacceptable. Another challenge was far more practical. Changing the calendar would require rewriting enormous parts of modern society. Laws, contracts, financial systems, school schedules, and international agreements are all built around the existing calendar. Replacing that system would involve a global transition affecting billions of people. And there is another factor that historians often point to: historical inertia. Once a system becomes deeply embedded in everyday life, changing it becomes extremely difficult. Even if a new design appears more logical on paper, the cost of replacing the existing one may simply be too great. So the world continued using the calendar that had developed gradually over centuries, a system shaped not by perfect symmetry, but by layers of historical decisions. And yet the question remains. The calendar we use today organizes the lives of billions of people. Its structure feels natural only because we have always known it that way. But if humanity were designing a calendar from the beginning today, would we really choose this one?